Welcome to the second unit of Module 12 for the MOOC on Indian economy, policy and environment. And in this unit, we are going to discuss about the economic reforms and its outcome. And I am Professor Joydeep Borwa, Professor and Director, School of Social Sciences, KK Hendricks State Open University. In the previous unit, we have discussed about economic reform programs in India, where we have tried to analyze three basic questions: that what was the context and background in which the economic reforms program in India were undertaken. The second, we have tried to examine the major components of economic reform programs. And then third, we have discussed about the major debates in India regarding economic reform programs. And in that context, we have raised the question that one of the major questions relating to economic reform programs in India is that whether the economic reform programs has been successful. And this is the unit in which we will take up this issue for some discussion. And the title, therefore, it is given as India's Economic Reforms and Assessment. Now, the assessment needs to be based on a stated objective in terms of most critical indicators. When you try to make assessment with regard to economic reforms, then you need to understand what were the intended objectives and how those intended objectives were achieved. And that can be measured through a series of indicators which we consider most important. And we have discussed that basically economic reforms try to answer three basic questions. The one was regarding the growth, how to accelerate the growth, because the economy was not growing, you needed more growth, and whether economic reforms could achieve the kind of growth targets that we have made. So that's the first question. The second question is that whether the economic reforms could result in the containment of fiscal deficit. And the third question, that whether economic reforms could address the issues related to vulnerabilities in the external sector. So these are the three basic questions, and then we will of course discuss the other questions related to these three questions. Let me come to the growth performance. When we see the growth performance, we can say that economic reform programs have been largely successful in achieving high growth rates compared to the pre-reform period. If we look at data, then you will find that from 1951 to 1979, the average growth rate was 3.5%. From 1980 to 1990, the average growth rate of India during that decade was 5.6%. As I have said in the earlier unit, that in 1980s, within the Indian economy, we tried a sort of measures which are directed towards a more flexible, liberal kind of management. And that resulted positively, which encouraged to go for further liberalization and further opening up in the 1990s when we have economic reforms. The very important to understand that during the period of 1980 and 1990, the growth rate of China was 9.2%. China had already adopted liberal economy since late 70s. So therefore, when we compare these performances of two, then we can see that India stands at 5.6%, China was 9.2%. And during the period of crisis, the growth rate plummeted. That is, in 1990-91, the India's growth rate was 1.4%, whereas the ASEAN countries were growing at a rate of 7.4%, China was still 9.2%. And that gave a kind of signal that unless and until, if we do not go for opening up, if we do not go for, the flexibility or privatization or liberalization, then it is very difficult to grow. And that was the kind of signal which resulted in economic reforms. 1992-96, the first phase of liberalization resulted in a little higher growth rate, 6.4%. Then 97-2002, it was around 6%, 5.7%. And during that period, China continued to be around 9%, more than 9%. 2002-2015, the growth rate has been around 8%, which is quite impressive, where the China was 9% still. So therefore, if we look at the long period since 1991, you can easily find that economic reform resulted in higher growth compared to the entire period from 1951 to 1979, where the average growth rate was 3.5%. So therefore, the first indicator, that first question, that whether economic reforms could produce the accelerated growth or not, we can say that largely yes to this question, that India's economic reform has resulted in, during the period of reform, that we have a higher growth rate compared to the entire period of the planning that we had. It is actually the 3.5%. And the growth during the phase of liberal period, that is the reform period, were comparable to that of ASEAN countries, to that of China. So therefore, we can largely say that yes, the economic reforms program could produce higher growth performances in the economy. Now, second question which we asked was that whether economic reform programs could contain the fiscal deficit. And again, we can say that it is mostly successful in the sense that fiscal deficit remained relatively low during the post-reform period, that is below 6%, barring few exceptions. For instance, during the period of COVID, for most of the years, compared to 8%, 9% fiscal deficit, which we used to have earlier. So therefore, yes, in terms of fiscal deficit, that we have mostly been successful during the reform period. And most importantly, it was made a part of the agenda of the reform itself, in the sense that we have enacted an act in 2003 known as FRBM Act, that is the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, where it was made obligatory to contain fiscal deficit on the part of the state. And it has to outline, as a part of this obligation, you have to outline strategies that how will you try to, how the state will try to manage the fiscal deficit within the limit of around 3%. It was a target, according to the FRBM Act, that you should have ideally around 3% fiscal deficit. And if you are there, then you have actually fiscal consolidation. That means that you are managing your affairs quite well. You are not allowing additional or unsustainable expenditure. At the same time, you do not have any resources gap, and that is why the deficit is actually managed. So in this count, that we can largely say that there is a positive answer to this question, that economic reforms has been largely successful in containing the fiscal deficit. The third question was whether, in terms of addressing the external sector vulnerability, whether reforms were successful. Here again, we have to say that yes, we have done reasonably well in terms of external sector as well. For instance, current account deficit, that is the gap between the value of the export and import, is contained around 2% of GDP since 1991, barring in 2012-13, where we have got the deficit of 4.8%. And this was due to an external shock, increase in the oil prices globally. And barring that period, for most of the period since 1991, we are managing our current account deficit around 2%, which is quite good. If we look at the foreign exchange reserve, at the time of 1991 reform, we had a barely minimum foreign exchange reserve, sufficient to cover only 3 weeks import. Now, that is the 1991 value was 5.8 billion dollar. Now we have significantly increased that. It increased to 642 billion in 2021, and now we are having 6,054 billion dollar in last March 2025. So therefore, if you look at the position, that from simple 5.8 billion dollar in 1991, that has increased manifold, quite substantially, to 654 billion dollar in 2025. So you have increased the foreign exchange reserve. In fact, the India's foreign exchange reserves remain quite robust, and India ranks in the fourth position among the countries having the largest holder of foreign exchange reserve globally. The first is China, followed by Japan, then Switzerland, then India. And this is largely due to enormous increase in the FDIs, which came as a part of reform program. Earlier, there was a ban, there was a restriction regarding inflow of FDI, that where sectors were not opened up, it was blocked by policy, and now you have opened up most of the sectors where FDI, foreign direct investment, can be invested, and therefore you are having huge inflow of FDI which goes into the reserves, and that is how the India's foreign exchange reserves remain very robust during the period. So if we look at the growth figure, and if we look at the fiscal stability indicator in terms of fiscal deficit, and also the balance of payment performances, that all three counts, that India's economic reforms have resulted positively, and we can say that we have been largely successful in achieving the main goals for which economic reforms have been intended. Now we need to have other questions also. The one question was that whether India's growth has been inclusive enough. That is, it has accelerated, no doubt, but whether the growth has been inclusive. And here we have divided answers. The many believe that it has been inclusive in the sense that the poverty, for instance, has been reduced substantially. This India's growth, the accelerated growth, high growth, has resulted in enormous success in reducing the poverty, which we call growth is being pro-poor. Let us look at some figures. In 1993-94, the poverty ratio in India was 45.3%, with 403 million people identified as poor or estimated to be poor. In 2004-05, the headcount has gone down to 37.2%, and in 2011-12, it has further reduced to 21.9%. And most importantly, in absolute numbers, the number of poor has also declined. It is not only the percentage headcount, but also the absolute number of poor which have gone down from 400 million poor to 269 million. So there's an absolute decline in the number of poor, not only the headcount ratio. So therefore, this means that there is some positive impact on poverty, and this can be attributed to high growths. So therefore, we believe that growth has been pro-poor, and when you have growth pro-poor, that benefits are being received by the poor, then we say that this is inclusive. That's one part of the story. Now, in the second part of the story, you have to see the other part, other aspect of inclusive growth. And we have discussed this part in detail in our unit related to inclusive growth in India. I'm repeating some of the arguments that we have presented there. For inclusion, you have two ways of looking at the things. One is, of course, pro-poor, that is whether benefits are being received by the poor or not. And on that count, we have seen that there is a reduction in the poverty ratio, and there is a reduction in absolute number of the poor, and therefore we can largely say that growth in India during that period, reform period, has been pro-poor largely. However, there is another aspect. the process aspect of growth, that whether the process of growth has been broad-based. Broad-based means whether it has allowed participation of larger section of people, and that is measured through the employment. That whether this growth is coming from increased employment, because growth means more output, and you can produce more output when you increase employment. And if it is there, then you have a process is very inclusive, everybody is actually partner in that higher growth. So that gives you a kind of situation when the growth is broad-based, and that is a more meaningful indicator of inclusive growth. And if we see that that is not happening. For instance, if you look at, suppose, the period of high growth, for instance, you have the around 7%, 8% growth rate for during the period 2003 to 2010. Now, during the period, you will see that employment growth has been declining. In 2009, during the period of 2009 to 2005, the India's annual employment growth was around 2%. 2005 to 2010, it has gone down to 0.7%. 2010 to 2012, further down to 0.4%. And 2012 to 15-16, it is negative. That is, in absolute number, the employment is declining. And accordingly, you can see the reflection in the labor force absorption rate also coming from NSSO, that the labor force absorption rate declined from 38 to 15% during the period from 2005 to 2012. So therefore, this high growth period is clear that it's not generating enough employment, and the debate is there around jobless growth. So we say that the growth is there, poverty is reduced, but it is not being able to create employment for masses, employment for most of the people. And we have also discussed a certain feature when we have discussed the whole period of Indian economy, that when you have unemployment very high, then you have a large reserve army, excess supply, it will actually suppress the wages or income for most of the people. And that is precisely happened, and we have discussed that part. So therefore, this aspect of inclusive growth is extremely important to understand whether the high growth can be sustained in the long run or not. Not only that employment was not growing, but we have also seen during the same period, there is an increasing casualization and informalization affecting the quality of work. That when you have huge casualization and informalization, the quality of work suffers. That is indicated by low pay and high insecurity. And that kind of work has proliferated during the entire period of reform. Since reform, the kind of employment we see is mostly actually in the unorganized sector. Unorganized sector employment is now constitute more than 90% of our employment. And most importantly, within organized sector, there is increasing informalization. For instance, suppose if in organized sector, the regular post gets vacant, it is being filled up by contractual staff. So therefore, this situation creates a kind of situation where high income and employment insecurity takes place and affects adversely the quality of work. So therefore, not only the jobs are not growing, whatever jobs are being created are mostly in the unorganized sector, marked by casualization and informalization, which indicates an inferiority created within the labor market. So that's the second part of the story. Now, if you look at the income growth of the population, then you will see this graph. That you see that income of the rich has grown much faster compared to those of the bottom. And that is where we have to see that the kind of growth process it is being taking place. That jobless growth, not enough employment is being created. And when there is a huge unemployment coming up, then you have a large reserve army, incomes are not growing for the masses, then you see this kind of a situation that those who are in position, those who are in secure jobs, their income is growing, but most of the people, the income is not growing that much. In the second graph, it provides a clear picture of income growth in India from 1951 to 2014. The blue curve gives you a sense that 50% of people, the bottom 50 percentile people, how their income is growing, and the red curve is giving you the top 1%. And you see that around 1990, there is a reversal. The income of the bottom 50% is declining, and income of top 1% is growing much faster. And around 2005, the income of the top 1% becomes surpassed the curve of the bottom 50%, which means that there is a general decline in the economy, general decline in the wages, the rich becoming more rich, and poor becoming more poor. So therefore, this picture is not consistent with the poverty reduction picture when we discuss the question of inclusive growth in India. So this is the situation of inequality that we have. That enormous inequality during the reform period, enormous insecurity during the period of reform, enormous unemployment during the period of reform. Altogether, even if we have been able to achieve the stated objectives of growth, fiscal deficit, and balance of payment crisis, it has resulted in a situation where there is a worsening of the welfare of the general people. All right. Now, to sort of summing up, we have a concern for this exclusion in the entire reform period. We have seen the process of growth has been very inclusive, and when we take the notion of poverty reduction, but we have seen that there are inherent elements of large-scale dispossession, which in turn adversely affected the income distribution, and that limits the growth prospects in future. That we have seen that poverty has been reduced, we have seen a quote-unquote inclusive, but we have also seen that within the same process, there are inherent elements of large-scale dispossession, that people are not getting employment. These are being replaced. Even if they are getting employment, they are replaced from the formal employment to an informal employment. And that affects the whole question of income, their income growth. That is evident from the graph that I have presented. And when you have large-scale income stagnation, then it provides a kind of a challenge for future growth prospects. So therefore, the question is that whether Indian growth will be sustainable in the long run, which we have seen around 6%, 7%, 8% around 2008, 2009, 2010. So that's the question, that whether reform has resulted in growth, but whether the growth can be sustained given the condition of the people that it has created. Many argue that reforms have not been sufficient enough, and therefore this is the result. Many argue that poverty reduction is only one part. We could have addressed the distribution part also had the reforms could have been more. If we have a more series of reform, more privatization, more opening up, then things could have been actually much better. And they believe that it is not enough, it is not sufficient, and therefore probably we need further push. Now, this gives us a question that whether we should continue or whether we should actually rethink about the reform. The others argue in favor of rethinking, because if the process itself is exclusionary, the process is not creating jobs, process is inherently dispossessed, there is an element of dispossession within the process, then you try to push it further, then there will be further exclusion. There will be much worsening of the situation. And therefore, they believe and they argue that pushing further will result more dispossession, and therefore it is going to create a problem for us. So this is a kind of a situation that we have, and they favor a distribution sensitive reforms rather than growth sensitive reform. So in a nutshell, if we try to summarize or conclude, then probably we can come up with these points. Of course, the economic reforms, much has been achieved. We have accelerating growth. We have been able to limit the fiscal deficits. We have been able to address the vulnerabilities of the external sector. So in these indicators, stated objectives, the economic reforms have been mostly successful. But as we have tried to solve the old set of problems, the new set of problems arise. We have solved the problem of growth, the problem of inequality have arrived, problem of unemployment have arrived. So therefore, the solving the old problems have generated new set of problems. Now question is how to address the newly emerging issues and concerns. Should we continue with the existing set of reforms, believing that it has not been enough? Or should we think about new set of reforms, which is not growth centric or not growth sensitive, but more distribution sensitive? This answer, the question, determines the India's economic future. And this question we will take up in the last unit of the module, when we will be trying to envision India's economic future. So with this, I conclude today's session. Thank you very much.